Welcome everyone to the monthly breakfast for dispute resolvers, co-hosted by the Association for Conflict Resolution of Greater New York and the City University of New York Dispute Resolution Center at Justice. We've been holding these breakfasts every month on the first Thursday of the month since 9/11. This is breakfast number 225. I am Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay and the director of the Dispute Resolution Center, and started these breakfasts way back. Now it seems like what, 18 years ago, 18 and a half years ago. Every month it takes a village for us to pull these breakfasts together and to organize them, and I'm really delighted to be part of an extraordinary team consisting of Julie Denny, Chuck Newman, Matthew Latimer, Nikki Borofsky, and this month we were joined by Alex Yaroslavsky, who was also last month's speaker. We couldn't do it without everyone pitching in and pulling all the pieces together. We want to apologize for the double registration this month. We have for years been keeping the archives on the ACR-GNY website, and so we were trying to maintain that list, but with the Zoom edition we needed to have everyone register on the Zoom system, so it created this double registration for everyone. Hopefully in the future we'll be able to integrate those systems. For this morning, I am really delighted that Noam Ebner is here with us. One of the benefits of the new virtual environment is that we can have speakers from wherever they are. They don't have to be with us physically in New York. So what we've lost by the intimacy in the room, we have gained by having a worldwide, global audience of colleagues that we would not otherwise have. And Julie is going to introduce Noam in just a minute, but before she does, I'm going to turn this over to Nikki so that she can make a quick announcement about the ACR-GNY virtual conference. Nikki?
Good morning. Thank you, Maria, so much. It's great to see you all here in this virtual breakfast roundtable. I hope you're getting something good to eat. I just wanted to remind everybody or announce that we are going virtual with the ACR-GNY's annual conference this year. Our theme is Focus Forward. I think it's very appropriate. It's going to be sessions spread out over the course of 4 days from Tuesday, May 26th to Friday, May 29th. And this year we're providing a special complimentary registration for anybody who joins ACR-GNY. And the conference itself will be free of charge to all ACR-GNY members. So I encourage you all to visit the link that I'm going to post in the chat. Join. It's $50 a year for membership, $25 for students, and that will give you access to not only the conference, but also help support all of our great programming, including the Roundtable breakfast. So thank you so much, and I will now mute myself and wait for the program.
Great, thank you, Nikki. I am going to turn this over to Julie to introduce Noam, who will be focusing on beyond technology, conflict resolution, and resolvers. Thank you, Noam, for being with us here in New York. Welcome back to New York, I should say, right? As a former New Yorker. Julie?
So Noam is eminently well qualified for today's presentation. He's a professor in Creighton University's Department of Interdisciplinary Studies. He's an early innovator in online teaching, former chair of Creighton's online graduate degree program in negotiation and conflict resolution. And before that, he taught for more than a decade at universities around the world while practicing as an attorney, negotiator, mediator, and mediator trainer. He used to be from New York, but now he's in Jacksonville, Florida, and in the interim, he lived in Israel for many years, working as a practitioner in Jerusalem, teaching, training, consulting, both there and in the US and other countries around the world. He's worked at the crossroads of conflict resolution and technology in practice, teaching, and research for more than 15 years. and he's a fellow of the National Center for Technology and Dispute Resolution. He regularly gives lectures and keynote addresses on technology's role in conflict and its resolution, on technology's broader effects on society. Gee, do we have any interest in that? And how these affect in-person negotiation and mediation processes, and also on the likely future evolutions of the negotiation and dispute resolution fields. I should add that the slides that Noam will show us today will be available later to anyone who wants them, and we'll give you information about how you can do that. With that, I turn it over to Noam. Welcome to the Roundtable Breakfast, Noam.
Well, thank you, Julia. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, everybody. And thank you all for coming. After all of that introduction, it's going to be a bit of a letdown when I try to share my screen and that doesn't work. Let's see how that goes. If that goes, someone can give me a thumb up. Okay, thank you. I want to say, well, maybe I should start with my mixed emotions about this. In the sense that I've wanted to join these breakfasts for years. As Maria said, I'm originally from New York, from Washington Heights. Everything going on in the city draws me. And ever since I presented at a conference at the ACR-GNY's annual conference, which is taking place soon, and you should find out the information for that. But ever since participating in that in 2013, I've been receiving invitations to the breakfast every month. And the topics and the speakers, and I was always so envious. And I didn't unsubscribe from the list even when I was living in Israel, because I figured, you know, at some point I'm going to get lucky. I'll be in the city. I'll be in the city at the right time, and this will happen. It didn't, I'll say yet, but here I am. And on the one hand, like, this is not how I intended this to go. Like, in so many things that are going on nowadays. I'll also add on that I never expected to be on this side of the microphone, and I'm really humbled by that, because I know who else has spoken to the group. And I want to thank everybody who came. I know in general, we've all been doing many pivots over the past 6 to 8 weeks. And one of those is the pivot by the organizers of the Roundtable to take it online with Alex and headed by Alex. But in my conversations with Maria, with Chuck, Julia, Matt, Nikki, and Alex, I got the sense that they were thrilled by the challenge, happy for the opportunity. This might not actually be true, but that's what it looked like behind the scenes. And I really appreciate the admirable pivot that you've made. And ditto for participants, for realizing that we could do this. Some of you are used to this format. Some of you are decidedly not used to this format. Some of you have resisted this format for years, and with very good reasons. I'm glad you're all here. And listen, if towards the end of this session, it was, it was interesting or it wasn't, it was, reflective or it wasn't, but you still feel, well, it still wasn't the same as being in person, I won't argue with you, and I'm going to pre-apologize. I've never met anyone about whom I would say, boy, that guy really hits his stride in his natural environment on Zoom. And that's where this person should be working. So I'm no exception. I'm no exception to that rule. So what are we here for? I think in the spirit of the new environment for the Roundtable, and so much else of what we're doing, things are changing. And in fact, the best way I could find to express it is, you know, a delta. The Greek delta is the mathematical symbol for change or for difference. So this is my way of saying change is in the air. And it's in the air in different ways for everyone. The Roundtable is an example. My own work, you would think it remains largely the same. I teach fully online at Creighton University's program on negotiation and conflict resolution. In that sense, my day-to-day travel plan, you know, have not been greatly disrupted. But still, no matter how used to this stuff you are, no matter your lifestyle, no matter your patterns, to different extents, but still, change is in the air. And we are all dealing with things that we have never dealt with before. And change is so much in the air that things that I was thinking this morning about things that in 2019 were perfectly normal seem crazy in 2020. Like, imagine yourself walking down a jetway, and in one of those enclosed jetways with 50 other people scrunched up behind you, and getting onto that plane, and then sitting in a tube with a stranger to your right, a stranger to your left, 8 to 10 people within 6 feet of you. I could go on, but I won't, because I'm even just talking about it, I'm cringing. And it kind of makes me want to go and jump into a tub of refreshing hand sanitizer. So those are things that you know, normal and crazy have changed, and vice versa. Things that in 2019 seemed crazy are perfectly normal nowadays. Okay, so Exhibit A might be this Roundtable. I don't know if this would have sounded crazy, but it was not preferred, that's for sure. But just an example that stands out for me is that throughout 2019, Elaine Greenberg from St. John's School of Law and I tried to publish an article on online courts, online dispute resolution, and online mediation. And we submitted it to top law reviews, many of them, and they unanimously rejected it. And just to be safe, they rejected it a second time, the second time we submitted it. And now, of course, 2 months later, 3 months later, here we are. All courts are either shut down or online to one extent or another. All mediators have all shut down or have gone online to some extent or another. All lawyers have shut down or have gone online to some extent or the other. And this isn't me saying, you know, working out my disappointment or my vindication. Way past that, and the article will eventually be published. But more to say that there are things that we could not have even imagined would have become just so temporarily normal. I'm not going to get into the big picture question right now of, so what is the new normal going to be? Although we will reach that. And there are many good guesses about that. But what I am saying is I'm appreciating how people and systems are adapting. And I'll say, when I say adapting, I'd like to differentiate adapting, which is kind of, let's call it temporarily modifying behaviors, activities, actions, modes in order to suit external circumstances or pressing needs, and a deeper process of change in which the effects of adapting cause us to change, to be different, not just to act different or, you know, to react different, but to actually be different. I'm planting that early because that will be a recurring theme as we go along. To get a sense for the adaptation we've gone through, and here I'm shifting into us as conflict professionals. I know that there are many people here with different years of experience in the field, different activity in different areas of the field. What is this field thing anyway? But there are, whatever we're going to talk about, folks doing conflict. And folks doing conflict, whether you're a mediator, an arbitrator, an attorney, or any a conflict engagement expert of any other sort, I found this this infographic, this timeline of virtual ADR that Nikki shared around. And Nikki, this is brilliant, and kind of the 5 stages of how the field transitioned towards thinking that, okay, you know, video-based mediation is actually something that we can do. I know there are some people on this call who may have been doing it for months or years already, but most of the mediation field and other conflict fields have gone through this transition very rapidly. However, I did want to, since we're talking about adaptation and pace of adaptation, I do want to point out that most of the field went through this more or less, depends on where you are and what you were doing, but you know, if you needed to put a pin in it, let's say about then, stages 2 to 5, about then. It might have been a week earlier, it might have been 2 weeks later, that's fine. This is the same period in which higher education did exactly that thing. And you could use the same infographic, change a few of the words, and you're the same. Same thing, same time. I do want to note, though, that the first stage took a lot longer. The notion of online mediation was introduced probably before that in different ways, but it was actually implemented and started to really be looked at in about 1996 with different projects that went on. Then early on became known as ODR, online dispute resolution, but that is when activity in online mediation and other conflict activities became kind of a thing that was available, and most of us in the field, particularly until the last 3 or 4 years in which it began to mainstream, most of the field held off on that and waited. Not everybody withheld their judgment, of course, but held back from actually doing that. So I find that it's important to talk, when you're talking about change, it's important to look at the pace of things. So stage 1 took about 25 years. Stage 2, 3, 4, and 5 took between 5 minutes and 2 weeks, depending on you and kind of what happened throughout your initial, how do we do this, through to, here's my first mediation session, how's it going? The question of, after stage 5, the question of what's gonna happen tomorrow, whenever tomorrow is, and by tomorrow I mean whenever this is all over, and I'm running out of air quotation marks to try and you know, reach the concept of what are we going to return to if we ever return. So will there be a period in which some people actually prefer the online mode, in which parties prefer the online mode, in which we start at least to make question, you know, to differentiate, maybe this situation is suitable for an online mode or not. These are all things that really remain to be seen, and I'll be interested in what their timeline is. It may be that there are already people who have reached the conclusions, heck, I don't know why I have not been doing this all my life. And there might be people who have already sworn that the moment they can bring people into their room, they are going to throw their laptop away. So there are going to be different decisions and different preferences on this. It's going to be interesting. But again, that brings us to the adaptation as opposed to change. We are all adapting. And I think that the field, both because of, I think, kind of our proactive nature, many people in the field have done a wonderful job of adapting, and also, and this also typifies our field, the many wonderful people who, like Alex, stepped up and said, "Hey, I've been doing this. I'll tell you the first few things you need to know in order to get started." And so many people would have found it challenging to start without that, and that also typifies our field. We don't set up entry barriers on purpose. And I think that's one reason that our field was able to shift so quickly to make that adaptation. What about change? Well, that's a different question. And once again, I will note it's one thing to notice that we don't have bagels right now being served. And it's another thing to consider what will come after when this is all normal. And I'd like to make a shift from what is going on right now to longer term or processes that are more far reaching than how do I set up a breakout room. And I'd like to put a few things on the table ahead of time. Some of you may, to the extent that anybody has ever heard of anything I've done, I find it very interesting to listen to that introduction and say, oh yeah, right, I've done that. But I've been involved in online and technology and dispute resolution for many years now. And I know that it's very, very easy to get lost in the technology, okay? And since I've been doing it for so long, I'm very appreciative of people who change their mode of managing their magical processes and figuring out how it would work online. And a lot of that had to do with figuring out technology. But here's the technological trap, that the moment you start dealing with technology, you kind of zoom in on technology. And every time I feel that starting to happen, start to happen to me, I notice I have to yank myself out and look at big picture and look at what is really going on here, either with regards to people as opposed to technology, or with regards to process over time, as opposed to what's the cutting edge in technology now. So for that purpose, I have, and this is something I say to myself every so often, it's probably amusing if you catch me muttering to myself, is to use General Organa or Princess Leia's scolding of Poe, for those of you who follow the movies, and telling him, get your head out of the cockpit, when he just saw a narrow part of the mission ahead of him and didn't see the big picture. So every so often I say to myself, Ebner, get your head out of the cockpit and try to see the big picture. And I'm going to assume that role today for you to some extent, because I know that in the early phases of transitioning to technology, what we really want to do is make sure we know how to set up Zoom settings and make sure we get it right, and that we know how to do a caucus without accidentally letting the other people hear what's going on in the caucus, and figuring out what do we do if the call drops, and all of these things that take over our mind. I am going to try to lift us or yank us out of there, but I want to clarify again that that is not a lack of appreciation for how important that is or how significant your work is now to transition. So please don't hear it that way. It's only because, and here I'll say it both provocatively and because I think it's true, is that even though the shift, the adaptation of technology is challenging and important, and even though I've dedicated a large part of what I've been doing for the past decade and more to technology. And even though I recently wrote in an article with Alice and Carol that one of the thing that I consider the biggest threat to the field's ongoing viability is our lack of comfort with technology. Despite all that, I will suggest to you that technology is actually the least interesting part of what is going on with conflict resolution, and conflict resolvers in this pandemic and beyond. And that's what I'm going to try and keep us focused on throughout this talk. We're going to go beyond technology. In order to go beyond technology, I'm going to suggest that all this, even though it has been awakened by the pandemic, or more to the point, it's been brought into focus, sharp focus, urgent focus by the pandemic, all this is part of a much larger change process that has been going on with humanity in general, society and individuals, as well as with conflict, negotiation, and mediation over the course of the past, I don't want to pin it down, so let's call it a generation or so. Okay? And since I've been tracking this, phenomenon over the past 10 years, 12 years, I'm able to recognize its signs as it kind of speeds up during the pandemic. In that sense, I'm kind of taking the position of the farmer's insurance advertisement popped into mind. I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. We know a thing or two because we've insured a thing or two. So even though things are now happening really quickly and they have their own unique flavor, actually what's going on now has been going on for nearly a generation. And I'm going to take us back to understanding that process of what's been going on over the past generation, and then we can start looking at why this period is so acute in that regard. So by the end of today, we'll not only understand changes that have been going on in conflict in the conflict world for the past decade or two, but we'll also understand, I think we'll understand a bit more about the pandemic, not from a medical side, of course, but from our own professional perspective, I hope better than we did before. That's what I hope, the point that we'll reach by the end of this, and I'm looking forward to hearing your comments, your questions, your suggestions on that. I certainly don't have the whole picture. I can just point some stuff out. So if we can look away from Zoom, here's what I've been hearing people talk about during the pandemic, and this is what I read in the the infographic that Nikki made. Between the lines, once you're not looking at technology, I hear that change is going on, and that adaptation is going on, and it's causing change. There are emotional aspects to this. There's anger at Zoom bombers. There's anger at the need to do this. There's frustration with having 8 Zoom meetings a day. In other words, all of our peopliness is involved in this developing attitude with and towards technology. And finally, as I demonstrated, the pace of change is speeding up. And all of this has to do very familiar hallmarks of what has been going on over the course of the past generation. And that's why we'll be able to understand, as I said, what's going on now for real other than technology. And as soon as we've mastered how to function in Zoom or how to, or any other video conferencing or mediation technology, what do we need to start looking at as the really important stuff? So in order to explain that, and since I've used the word acceleration and we're talking about speed, and since I've been working a lot on a project on conflict resolution and Star Wars, and more widely a project on conflict resolution and pop culture. So we're going to go back to the future, back to things that have been going on over the past generation in order to explain where we are now and where all this is going. And I'd like just to highlight the note of acceleration. Things are happening faster than they used to. Change is happening faster and will continue to do so. I will give examples, okay? So what better place to start than with our changing world? And I figured that as long as you're going to have a technological flavor to our changing world, then there's nothing like a globe and some binary stuff and some snazzy digits and gigawatts and something that looks actually like a model of a Death Star to suggest that our world is changing and technology has something to do with it. I'll share, excuse me, that my own journey, both personal and professional, are reflective and enabled by this changing world. I grew up in Washington Heights, moved to Israel, as a child, lived in Jerusalem, and immediately was cut off from everything, you know, that a 10-year-old American boy experiences and lives with. I mean, sports scores would only reach Israel 3 days after the game had happened. And this wasn't in the 1920s, this was in the 1980s. But still, if we wanted to know like what is going on in more or less real time, we actually had to listen to the voice of America on shortwave radio. And the fact that I'm sure that many people on this call, you know, don't even know what that is indicative of, you know, how the world used to be. And that was relatively a modern world. But still, since back then when you moved geographically, you were cut off. And like, if I don't know if the Yankees won, then, you know, then who am I? And I lived for about 35 years in Jerusalem, and more recently decided to take a break from the Middle East, which is, by the way, something that I strongly suggest to everybody living in the Middle East. And I moved with my family, seeking some degree of stability and normal and peace and quiet, neighbors, just pleasant and reasonable and rational and all that, and moved to Florida. And perhaps the fact that that was my choice in order to achieve all of those goals that I said, maybe that will lead you to treat my research, such as I'm about to present to you, with a grain of salt. But here we are, and my career has also certainly been a product of our changing world. Early on, wanting to, let's put it this way, Israel is a pretty small pond in terms of conflict resolution. I don't know if there is anyone from Israel here, but you know, but it's true. There's an old joke about how in New York, any day now, there's going to be the tipping point where there are more lawyers than people. And so, first of all, in Israel, there are more lawyers than people than there are in New York per capita, just in case you thought that you were living in the epicenter of legal activity. But not only are there more lawyers per capita in Israel, there are certainly more mediators per capita. Just about everybody in Israel, you can't throw a rock without hitting a mediator. And given that everybody wants to mediate and nobody wants to be mediated, which is not a specifically Israeli problem, I wanted to take my show on the road. And at first I did that by traveling the world and teaching in beautiful and interesting places. But I also had a family and I wanted to be with them. So I wanted to overcome geography. Along the way, even though I avoided email all through college, because I saw I really had no deficiency in terms of chain emails or lolcats or jokes. I quickly became interested in online communication and how this is going to connect people in a brand new way. And that turned into a fascination with online dispute resolution and online teaching. And this journey eventually led me to Creighton University, who at the right moment in time for me was setting up, they had established a master's program in conflict resolution and wanted to set up an online program, but but didn't necessarily have the expertise to make that jump. And when we joined together, it was a perfect match and has continued for 13 years or so now. And we have a program that is, it can be taken either wholly or primarily online, depending on whether you're taking a certificate or a degree. One course is a 1-week residency in Omaha. And I'm not saying that necessarily to shamelessly promote our own program, although while we're at it, but I'm also saying that in order to say that things don't necessarily need to be absolute one way or another. What is important is to be mindful about how you structure things. Is it for the good of the process to do some things one way, something another way? And I think that intentionality needs to carry over to everything that we think about technology and its role in our work and our lives. Technology is all about binary, but the choice of using technology is by no means a binary choice. Since moving online, or since around 2007, 2008, three paths of my work converged. The first was that I noticed in my research that even though people were discussing how there's more conflict online in terms of these flame wars spiking up in discussion forums on the internet, people suddenly being very sharp and antagonistic towards one another, and that people are fighting with each other all over Facebook, where in the past they didn't fight with each other all over Facebook because there was no Facebook. I started noticing that it wasn't just that there was more and sharper conflict, but there was actually perhaps new kinds of conflict that didn't fit neatly into our typologies and our models of conflict. And even when they did, they were different. There were different players involved. There were different actors. So a new conflict is evolving due to online activity, and sometimes that spills over into real world actions, interactions, and ramifications. So what happens online doesn't stay neatly online. That same insight of what happens online doesn't stay online is also true about noticing changes in myself. Having worked online for a long period of time, I noticed that I was changing. But it wasn't just that my online behavior was changing or my online persona was changing, but rather what I started to notice is that my increasing immersion in a technological world was causing changes in how I acted, and furthermore, how I felt, how I experienced, how I thought, essentially who I was, okay? And that's the difference between adapting and changing. This is changes in who I am. And finally, a third strand that joined that is a long series of projects having to do nothing with online activity, but having to do with negotiation theory, both in practice, both in its connection to the practice of negotiation and its connection to teaching. A series of projects, and they all kind of boil down to the same point, that there's something unsatisfying or incomplete in negotiation theory, something disturbing. It's simplistic, and it's not matching practice. As when we would either practice ourselves or open our ears to a practice to theory channel, as opposed to preaching a theory to practice channel, we realize that there's something, we're discussing the state of the art in theory, you know, building block after block on the early pieces, but it's not, something is not matching. It was actually this last strand that most directly led me to the project that I began in 2016, published in 2017, and am now continuing and kind of updating or reloading for today. So in 2017, I published an article called "Negotiation is Changing." And you can find it by Googling Ebner "Negotiation is Changing." And in "Negotiation is Changing," I tried to explain how the reason that negotiation theory, that there was this gap between negotiation theory and practice is simply because negotiation theory was largely constructed about 50 years ago, or between a period of 65 to 45 years ago. There have been small incremental additions, but let's call it between the earliest writers, not the earliest, but in 1965 or so, and up to the publication of Getting to Yes, okay? By that point, the 80% of the foundation of negotiation theory had been established. And everything that has been added to that, including work of my own, is not groundbreaking, is not necessarily fundamental. Some of it is, it can be, I don't say this dismissively when I say it's gravy. Gravy is my favorite part of Thanksgiving. So it is add-ons to the basic theory. The same, more or less, is true for mediation. And the same is true for conflict. And since there were slightly different years or different time periods for those two developments, I'll say this. All of the major theories of mediation were established before the world jumped sharply to technological immersion and online activity, okay? I don't know what your favorite theory of mediation is, but if you think about, if you think about some of it based on interest-based negotiation, so that was developed in the 80s, community mediation was developed in the 70s, even earlier. Transformative was introduced in the 90s, and narrative, late 90s, early 2000s, and then while there are other suggestions and others, but if we're looking at the big block of foundational things, it all cuts off, let's call it at the year 2000, okay? It all cuts off with the new millennia. And a lot of that is true about conflict theory as well. The foundations were all there before technology. And what I am suggesting, and will continue to suggest, is that what has happened since then is not that the theory was ever wrong. It's simply that people have changed. And human change was not taken into account. Now, I went ahead and wrote this all up in a excruciatingly long law review article because it occurred to me as I was thinking about it this morning. I thought, huh, you know, I'm the Robert Mueller of my topic, by which I think, you know, the way to change the world is to write things up in a very, very, very long document. That's definitely going to bring about change. The only difference is that I read his piece, and I don't think he's read mine. But and I say this because while it was well received in terms of it sparked a lot of good conversations with colleagues, nobody came out and called me an idiot to my face. Some people did disagree with parts or whatever, but there hasn't been much follow-on in terms of deep experimentation into how people have changed in terms of negotiation, mediation, or conflict, or what do we need to update in our own syllabi, mental professional maps, etc. So there's still a lot left to do, and I'm going to suggest that it has become more urgent and more acute now, because I think that the change that we've gone through over these past 15, 20 years has just received a new level of acceleration over the course of the past 2 months, and I'll explain that soon. You know, people have been speaking about change for a long time, and very often those comments about change have somehow been related to technology, whether this is explicit or not, whether this is important or not, but it does kind of support the notion that I suggest, that I think that as society and as individuals, our increasing immersion in technology over the course of a generation has changed people. It's being expressed in different ways. I'll also note that technology is not the only driver of change. I also need to get my head out of the cockpit and not think that just because so much of my world has to do with technology, that is the only driver of change. But I do suggest that with other drivers of change, whether spiritual drivers, educational drivers, economic drivers, I think that this is a unique moment in human history, moment, I mean a generation, at which technological change has shot off the charts. And I'll show some of those charts. But it is a particularly strong driver. But please don't take that to mean that this is the only thing going on. Au contraire, I think that other things merge with this and are going in the same direction. I'd be interested to hear if you think. So when change happens, technological change happens, humans cope with it. That's what we do. We cope with it. We adjust with it. And we have responses, reactions. Sometimes we avoid them. Sometimes we deal with them head on. And here's a set of rules that Douglas Adams laid out in the meaning of LIF. And I'm sorry, I think this is in the Salmon of Doubt for people who want to get precise. And he's someone who foresaw so much of this, even without intending to foresee the internet and different kinds of communication. He was just writing science fiction and satire, but he went ahead and recognized it. So I'm not a guy who reads out PowerPoint, so feel free to read it on your own. And I'll note that while there's there certainly is some ageism in there. And I think that age, while it was not a, it certainly was a factor in how people adapted or reacted more to the point of technology. It wasn't the deciding, older people are not going to adopt technology and younger people will adopt technology. That's what everybody kind of black and white put it out at the beginning of the technological era. And it just didn't turn out that way. But I certainly do think that for those of you, I know there are people of different ages here, for those of you who lived, grew up with, and particularly worked before the immersion in technology, you'll find that this makes a certain kind of sense. You'll find that you needed to transition. But one way of putting it is the distinction between digital natives and digital immigrants. I am a digital immigrant. I'm an early digital immigrant, but I'm a digital immigrant. My children are digital natives. They, my 10-year-old could text before he could write. Oddly enough, he could even text before he could talk. It's just really odd, but odd things are happening. And so we're seeing that we have responses to technologies, to changes in technology, new forms of technology, and our own immersion in technology. And I'd like to talk about certain types of change just to give you an example, just to give you examples that these things are real in a scientific, real world sense, and not in a general ideating kind of philosophical thinking about things sense, like, oh, everything is different now, technology. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that even though we have not been discussing this in the conflict field, human beings over the course of the past generation have been changing. They've been changing behaviorally, they've been changing psychologically and cognitively and physically, and they've been changing interactionally. And I particularly think that changing interactionally is really important to us as negotiators or mediators. And part of the interactionally stems from the behaviorally and the psychologically. So I think that we really need to be aware of what's going on in those other realms and either start to research what's going on in negotiation and conflict, or at least as practitioners, we need to start being aware of it, seeing it as it happens, and kind of kicking it up the line in a practice to theory kind of pipeline. Tell people writing books, that is not what happens. People are not the way you think they are sitting in your room writing about negotiation. Here's how they are. And I'm going to give examples of each of these. Okay, so here are some things, here are behavioral changes. And think about, just over the course of the past 10 years. I'm not going to say that we've all made all of these changes. Some of you on the line may have always, may have never done any of these without technology. Others have done each of these at different points over the past 10, perhaps 15 years. Others of you have only done half of them. There's one thing on this list that I would guess that each of you are resisting and kind of hold out to do that face-to-face. I call that, I think we all have a personal history and a personal evolution with technology. I think we also each have a personal resistory, that one technology that we refuse to use. But whatever it is, we have all adapted our behaviors over the course of the past decade. Now, by now, there's nothing revolutionary or remarkable about saying that, like, whoa, we've changed so much. That's not the point. The point is that this is adaptation. This is taking advantage of technology in different ways. So, but once you do a lot of adaptation, when you adapt to and use technology, it starts to change you. At first, it changes the way you do things. Sometimes that's really significant. For me, it reduced my commute, sometimes by as much as 8 hours each way. At the time that I started teaching online, I was also teaching in Turkey. And the trip from my home in Jerusalem to the campus in Istanbul was an 8-hour trip. And the shift in my life cut down my commute by 8 hours, each trip. So we all have our own story and our own changed behaviors, and over time, it has changed us. And I'd like you to think about that cup of coffee about to spill into the laptop, and I'd like you to imagine that that is your laptop. And you are the person who has just spilled your coffee. Excuse me while I take a sip of my own for dramatic effect. And I want you to consider how you're feeling as you watch those drops of water, drops of coffee about to cascade, and you know what's going to happen. And I'll leave you with that for a moment. A second exercise is look at that iPhone. You know what? By saying the word iPhone, I'm applying this to only one half of the audience. Look at that phone. Okay, and imagine that your child, or friend, or significant other, or whoever the doofus of the day is, has just dropped it into the toilet. For me, that's my children. And you've rescued it, and I hope you all know the rice trick for saving cell phones that have gotten wet. Absorbs the moisture, and it's sitting there, and you have to leave it there for a day. And when your phone is in there, it's in this Schrodinger's cat situation of you don't know whether you have a phone or not. Now join me in that moment, and how are you feeling? And what I'm going to suggest is that that feeling goes beyond your consideration of economic loss. It wasn't, oh man, that cost me $400. It's something else. It's that a part of us is in danger. That something, you feel it, you don't feel it so much here as you feel it in other parts of your body. It's like, oh. My suggestion is that increasingly, the reason that is because this technology is now part of us. We are increasingly, in every day and in every way, becoming cyborgs. Now, some people resist this term because we're used to cyborgs. It's like, so I have a computer implanted in my face. And okay, so if you're not feeling it, that's fine. I'd suggest that there's really very little difference between having a chip implanted in your brain and being a cyborg, and having a cell phone in your pocket, a micro inch away from your skin, 18 hours a day. There's very little difference measured in that micro inch between us really being cyborgs and us being sort of cyborgs. But if anybody here has ever, broken a laptop, I think you have felt that sense of, I can't think without it. To those of you who have never had that happen to you, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. So there is some of that going on. And there is also, again, to say that this isn't ways of thinking about things and philosophizing about it, but very practically, I'll ask you, have you ever felt, you have your phone in your pocket and you feel it buzz and you know that you've received a message, and you take it out only to see that you haven't received a message? And perhaps, like me, your first reaction when it happens is to say, oh, there must be some mistake here because I know I received a message. And this is happening to, it's not just you, or it's not just me. I was relieved to find it was not just me. It's not just you, it's all of us. And this is something that's being termed as phantom vibration syndrome, which we experience. It's a real thing. We experience a buzz against our thigh or wherever you keep your phone, even though the phone has not buzzed. And what this is signifying, and again, this is in a physiological and not in a philosophical way, is that our bodies are straining to make that connection through that last micro-inch of material. Our nerve endings are striving towards connection with technology to complete the physical distance between that our brains have already jumped and that our behavior has already jumped. And this is something, the vibration syndrome, that happens widely. It happens all the time. And I wonder what else happens all the time that we're just not aware yet, or it just hasn't been named yet, but that indicates this connection. Here's another, just a quick example of how this is not a philosophical change. This is a physical change in human body, is the notion of neuroplasticity. I'm no neuroscience scientist, and I was never a contributing member of the move to include neuroscience in conflict. I never had anything intelligent to say about that. But something that I hoped that neuroscience would contribute to negotiation and mediation and has not yet spoken about is the notion of neuroplasticity, which means basically that our brains change physically in order to adapt to the tasks that we provide them with. That's as simple. I'd say that's as simple an explanation as I can provide. I can also say that's as complex a definition as I can understand. But what it means is if we give our brain a complex task, it physically wires itself to the most efficient combination of synapses and neurons in order to complete that task. And when we take tasks away from it, it dismantles those and moves on to doing other tasks, okay? So the best way to describe how this affects us is to ask yourself, for those of you who are over, I don't know, over 30, 35, is how many phone numbers do you know by heart today? As opposed to how many phone numbers you knew by heart 10, 15, 20 years ago. The answer to 15, 20 years ago, all of them, right? And the answer to that today is not, none of them. I think there are some people, I can't see everybody on my screen view. And if I could, I'd say, how many people in this room do not know their own phone numbers? And I'm sure that a delightful number of hands would be raised. I know that I sometimes have to think twice. And the reason this is not, you could say, well, it's because I don't bother to memorize that because they're all in my memory now. It's not only that. It's ever since memories started to be developed for phone, and the memories were right there on the phone as opposed to the Rolodex that you might have left in the office. Or I had one of the first Casio databank watches that could store up to 50 phone numbers. There was a technological breakthrough of the 1980s. I felt like the bionic person. But the thing is, it's not just that we don't bother to memorize them. It's that we have cognitively offloaded the task of remembering numbers from our brains to technology. Okay, just like we offload something off a computer onto a hard drive or onto a disk, a flash disk, so too, when the brain identifies tasks that it is no longer being required to do, the brain dismantles the processing power, the processing structure to perform that task. Another example of this has to do with navigation. Like those of you who navigate using Waze or all sorts of satellite navigation systems, try doing it without it. And you'll recognize that it's not just that you don't know how to get places. It's that your driving experience and your situating experience has changed. the notion of where we are and how that relates to everything around us and where we need to get to has fundamentally changed. We've offloaded that task to our phones and to these programs, and dismantled some of the internal navigation system that we have. And boy, is that going to make a big change in how people are with relations to space and geography. I mean, think about the zombie apocalypse, where technology breaks down. It's not just that we don't know how to make anything anymore. We won't. All these movies in which people escape from one city to some other part of it. We're not going to know how to get there. We're going to get stuck, at the first exit, because we've offloaded that capacity. By the way, there have been tests of people who deal often with that kind of geographical navigation. They did functional MRI tests of London cab drivers. And they found that London cab drivers who have to remember all of the routes through London's alleys, streets, and develop the ability not only to remember to drive on the right side of the road, but also, or on the wrong side of the road, but also to get to these places in a city that was not designed for cars, but was designed long before. The navigating section of their brain was much larger than the average person. So I'm talking about physical changes. Our sections are now diminished. That's the best way to make all this real. Of course, think about our interactional changes. Our networks have changed. The way we engage with them have changed. The way we avoid people, whether it's by pretending we're on our phone or by marking ourselves as absent, or all of the things that we do, all of our interactions, and the way we communicate with other people, and what's going on around us while we communicate. And this differentiation between how we communicate with each other and how we broadcast stuff to the world, another form of our communication. This is all new territory. So we are changing in all these fundamental ways. And yet, so it makes sense that if people are changing physically, psychologically, emotionally, behaviorally, it makes sense that, since, to the best of my knowledge, negotiators, when I was focusing on negotiation, then it also makes sense that negotiators are changing, people are changing in their actions as negotiators. If negotiators are changing, then negotiation itself must be changed from what it was originally envisioned as. And finally, of course, the same goes for when those negotiators are actually pretty angry at each other, and they are what we call parties instead of negotiators. The same goes for the processes they involve, they take part in then, which we can call conflict instead of negotiation. And of course, the same goes for us. We don't say, oh yes, people have changed, and we need to understand how they have changed. And David Matz from UMass Boston, who did a pre-read of my paper when I was writing it. And one suggestion of his that I continue to be grateful to him for was, he said, when you're writing about people and how they are, you're writing human beings, you might not want to use the word they. Try we. That always struck me as, that's a really good piece of advice. And often I think in our work as negotiators, we talk about how parties are. Our work as mediators, we talk about how parties are. And set aside or treat to a lesser extent that the fact that we are also there in the room. And not only do we all bring our own whatever, but that we are also triggered in the room. We are also responsive in the room. We are also reactive in the room. So a lot of the things that have to do, particularly on the neuroscience level, with our responses to conflict, they might happen to us also. But setting that aside, if we are changing as people, we are also changing as mediators. There's no way around that. And our parties are changing. And to tie this into the early conversation before we got started today, their lawyers are changing. Their judges are changing, by the way, also. So it's up and down the system. And when I went and explored what the field was saying about this, this is basically what I found. So to fill in that blank sheet of paper with a comment, there appeared to be an assumption that people are the same as they were in the 1970s and 80s. They appear to be that negotiators are as they always were, mediators are as they always were. Conflict mediation, negotiation as processes are always the same. Okay, and here's the point at which some people might say, I know this is a bit of a straw man suggestion, but there are a lot of non-straw persons out there who would say, wait, but what do you mean we're not changing with the times? You know, we're not taking this. And just last month, sorry, we had a session on online mediation, and we are getting with it. There's a literature in negotiation and a smaller literature in mediation on negotiating online or mediating online. So we are with the times. But that's what I call the instrumental smokescreen, okay? And I mean that that literature and this training, it focuses on on technology, not as a human changer. It focuses on technology as an instrument, something we need to use, a media channel. We do our best to figure out how to negate the negative effects of the channel which we dislike or which constrain our negotiation or our mediation. And again, there's that underlying assumption that humans are always the same as they've always been, unless, and here's the only exception, unless they are online. And when they are online, they might have these conflict behaviors or those conflict behaviors, but that we might need to know something about if we mediate online. But people, once they shut down that computer and walk out into the street or walk into the mediation room, they are the same they've always been. And I find that difficult to believe. And I particularly find it difficult to believe. I was reading, during this period, I was reading Marshall McLuhan, the communication expert, who explained to us, and while he was explaining to us why the medium is the message, he wrote that our conventional response to all media, namely that it's how they are used that counts, is the numb stance of the technological idiot. Now, I'm not saying that to insult anyone out there. I'm sharing that my response to reading this, I've read it before, but I read it again when I was working on this topic, was, oh my God, a technological idiot has my name written all over it. And it literally has my name written all over it, because if you Google my own work, you'll find that a huge, I haven't done that much work in the grand scheme of things, but many of my papers, many of the articles that I have out there are exactly on, how is media used and how to use it better. What I call the via literature, okay? Negotiation via email, negotiation via text, negotiating via video conferencing, mediation via video conferencing, which is the flavor of the month, right? So that's all the via. How do we use it instrumentally? But McLuhan is saying, Ebner, you're an idiot. It doesn't, that's not the important thing to look at here. It's not how you use the media that is really important here. What's really important is how it's changing you and how it's changing everybody as we use it. So I'm not saying, folks, you're focused on the wrong thing now in learning to transition online. Understanding the media, how the media works is not important. No, it is. We need to know how to function with technology. But I think that I suggest, and I'm speaking to myself once again, that focusing on that as if that's the important thing going on as different media become involved in our processes, that's a mistake. Okay, and that's where our head gets yanked out of the cockpit. Let me briefly give some examples of how these change processes that we've been going through affect core issues in mediation and negotiation. I'll do this very briefly. Anybody who wants to get into it, there's a whole article on that, and even the article is just examples, because you can look at any element that's in your negotiation or mediation textbook, your favorite textbook, and ask yourself, has anything about this changed if people have been changing on this issue over the past decade or two? So just an example, if you look at empathy, you hear now a lot of, what's at stake for mediation negotiation? We talk about empathy all the time. And there's a lot of important things at stake. When we teach our trainees and students, we teach them, here's why empathy is important. We also teach them, here's how you do empathy. And there's kind of some recipes, empathy recipes. And here's what you get out of it. Here are the benefits of building empathy, of showing empathy. And on the other hand, when you read, again, material mainly outside of negotiation, you hear that empathy is changing. And it's most conveniently structured that a lot of the literature takes a stance that these young'uns are different in empathy than we are. Okay, this is a good way into the topic. It's always easiest to conveniently point at someone younger than you and say they're different. Okay, particularly in a pejorative manner. So there's a lot of discussion how the kids growing up today, they spend all their time playing violent video games, so they don't know how to, communicate with other people. They don't know how to make eye contact. They don't know how to discuss things. They don't know how to talk issues out. Their body language is all different, and it's mainly this. And these violent video games is reducing their capacity for empathy. And there's a huge literature on all of these things. And I will say, I think that that's incredibly important because some of the people discussed in that literature, even, the pointing down at young'uns, so to speak, those people have now grown up and they're in the workforce. Sometimes there are bosses. And also, those are the people who, let's say, are in our workplace or divorce mediation processes. Some of those, let's say, the younger ones of those, are people who some of this literature was written about. I'm not going to get into the literature and what it says about different empathy, and there's a huge discussion about video games, for example. There's also the notion that, you can also positively affect empathy by playing pro-social video games. But that's not really the point here. The point is that there's a huge literature discussing human change. And I think that it's on a core issue of negotiation and mediation that we really would like to be informed if humans are changing in that, because a lot of what we teach, write, and practice has kind of treated that as a constant. That's just an example. A second example is the issue of trust. Trust, again, what's at stake? And for trust, it's all the good stuff. Everything that we talk, teach, and practice in mediation or negotiation courses has been shown to be mediated by trust, has been shown to depend on trust. Trust has been shown to improve it. And trust was shown in Stephen Goldberg's research to be the primary attribute, the number one tool that parties view as the mediator's primary and most valuable tool. The mediator's ability to generate trust, the party's trust in the mediator, okay? So if this is our main tool to some extent, I think we'd like to know if trust is changing. And I'm going to suggest that trust is changing in oh so many ways. And I'm not going to get into it deeply because I think that, that we see this day in and day out over the past, certainly over the past 5 years. It wouldn't be political, I think, to use the word over the past political cycle. It's kind of sharply spiked, changing in trust, but not only. I mean, even we used to ask our friends which restaurant we should go out to. And now we, for some reason, trust 168 total strangers on Yelp to give us advice. And by the way, we do that even though we know that a lot of them are lying, that a lot of them are manipulating something for one reason or another. We know that. And still, we view the reviews on Amazon and make up our mind. Of course, maybe it's only me. But anybody who's ever gotten into an Uber has changed the way they trust. You have fundamentally changed the way you trust people from when your parents told you don't take rides with strangers to the moment you got into an Uber. And that change in trust. It's not so we've changed how, you know, how we transport ourselves from place to place. No, it's a much deeper change in our mechanisms of trust, which spill out into how do we form trust towards a mediator? Or how do I, as a negotiator, get my counterpart to trust me? We have changed. And again, there are many other changes in any element you want to point at. There are other examples. Some are written in that article, Negotiation are Changing. Some are not. But it's happening. Okay. Now, without getting into it, I'm going to leave you to consider. I think that changes in the players, changes in who we are, affect changes in models. Like everything in what we do is built upon an understanding of how the negotiation or mediation model all works together. It's not just about objective criteria. It's about how objective criteria fit in with alternatives, fits in with options, fits in with interests, fits in with positions, fits in with communications, fits in with relationships, and that web is what brings it all together. But if objective criteria has fundamentally changed, then the system has changed. And I'm going to leave that as a thought rather than getting in. And I know we're getting on a time, and I want to. I just want to really focus on where that leaves us. That leaves us into take everything that you read about negotiation or mediation from here on, take it with a grain of salt, or ask yourself a question: is this still true about people? You might not know the answer at once, but you can start looking for it. And the first place to look for this is in yourself. Okay, because once you notice your own change processes, you'll know to see it in others, and then you'll know why this is such an important thing. I'm going to end by saying why. I'm going to jump forward and say, why is this so crucial now? This isn't the first period. This isn't the first technological development period. Technology has changed before. We moved from horses and carriages to cars. Other changes happened. But here's the thing. Never before in human history have we been subjected as people to so much technological change in so little time, and in so immersive a way, and in so demanding a way that the technology now reaches out and grabs us even when we don't want to use it. We get that beep. Technology is designed to make us want to use it. Some of the highest paid people in Silicon Valley are attention scientists. These are people with PhDs in how to make me want to return to the app through a series, through gamification and gratification and reward, and make me spend one more second of attention on the app, one more click of attention. Never before has humanity come up against that. So quite naturally, we are far more immersed in technology, even if we are not technological people. Okay, even if we don't work in technology, and even if we don't, still it is all happening to us at one point or another, and it's happening in a way that never happened before. The acceleration of change is on the rise, and that's how I want to look at today. My sense of today is, if we look at today, what has been happening for the past couple of months? We have a fluid, changing situation. The situation's traumatic, so it's imprinting. It's like, just like you remember where you were when X, fit in the leader of your generation, was shot. We remember where we were at 9/11. We remember traumatic events. This is going to be one of those long-term traumatic things. Impressions from it will be heightened. We are increasingly immersed in technology. Ask yourself, do you spend more hours watching TV, online, during this period than you previously did? Is there any new technology, a new app, a new thingy, let's say even besides mediating via Zoom, okay? Is there a new thingy that you started to use? Are there 3? Are there 5? Are there a dozen? Do you have an app for tracking how many people are sick and how many people are dying in the United States or around the world? Do you find yourself visiting 3 different apps in order to find that out? So we're immersed in new ways and in very concentrated ways. So it's a pressure cooker. And that pressure cooker is not only continuing to develop these issues. I mean, think about the notions of these past 2 months and how many issues of trust, empathy, attention, how often have these issues come up in different ways in the media, in yourself. And there are new issues, that these new negotiation and mediation central issues. You know, a handshake, right? That's simple, that's innocuous. But now, now think about making, shaking someone's hand. Think about shutting the door behind you and sitting around a small table with people. We've seen changes in people's attitudes towards authority, new attitudes to person. All of these have to do with negotiation, and it's going to have lasting effects that are not just adapting. Some of it will develop into human change. There's also been accelerated innovation, and I'm not going to get into it, but just think about all the stories you've heard about people developing new respirators on the spot, or 3D printing masks. There are 200 vaccines in the works all of a sudden. People making hand sanitizers out of I don't know what. And finally, just an example from our field, I'll make a plug. Accelerated innovation in our field. Michael Lang and a colleague have brought to publication, a book on living together, separating, divorce, surviving during a pandemic, with advice and guidance from 70 or 80 mediation experts. They brought this together in less than 3 weeks. Less than 3 weeks, that's the pace of change. Now you might say, well, this isn't technology, it's a book, but it's the pace of wrapping your mind around problems and developing a solution. It has just, never before has the conflict field seen, the conflict resolution field at least, seen something like this. So in my sense, we have had a decade, since I've been following this stuff over a decade, I know the cycles and I can see what's happening. And my sense is that we've had another decade crammed into these past 2 months. We are very busy right now with the technological smokescreen that has us looking at how do we mediate via Zoom, and not seeing past that to how is all this technological immersion going to change us and going to change our clients. All of the previous elements of deep human change that we're changing are reinforced, and new changes on the way. And as that happens, everything we think we know about negotiation and mediation is becoming outdated. Now that's the food for thought. Of course, we've also benefited from wonderful things. The field has increased its capacity beyond, just who can I fit in my office? I can mediate across, I can mediate at a distance, I can mediate in different countries. We've taken a step, in my opinion, towards long-term viability. We have a different attitude towards technology. It doesn't matter whether you like mediating online. I'm not only talking about mediating online. I think we need to be more positive towards technology, including how do we use it in our mediation rooms. But generally saying, the notion of incorporating technology in mediation is something we are all much more comfortable about, if only in a pinch. And I think that will have long-term ramifications. I hope that this session might have also put deep human change on the radar, and that you will help to identify just what that is and what these new conflict dynamics are. And finally, to leave you with a thought, this sentence from Clay Shirky, as we head back into the Zoom room, I think we're reaching the point now, or we will in 3 weeks, at which the communication tool of utilizing primarily video conferencing in order to mediate at a distance is about to become technologically boring. Many of us will have done it. We know how to do it. It's not this other thing. It's just something we do when we need to. That's when it becomes that's when it becomes technologically boring. And that's when it becomes socially interesting. What new things are we going to do in the world now that we're comfortable with that? How will mediation, what changes will we make to mediation processes in order to take advantage of what we have? And what things will people think of that the designers of Zoom or your trainers on how to mediate via Zoom never, ever considered that's when it becomes socially and professionally interesting. So thank you for staying with me. Thank you for lifting your heads out of the cockpit. I know that we have a lot to get back to, so if it drops back into the cockpit, go off and fly that X-Wing. Thank you. I know there's not a lot of time left. I apologize. I'll be here for as long as you are. So over to you. Thank you.
There are lots and lots of questions, so nobody's got their head in the cockpit here. No.
My apologies.
No,
Okay.
don't apologize. I wish you could have watched the chat while you were talking, but the whole thing is you can't really do that. But there's enormous appreciation for the issues that you've raised. Everyone wants copies of the slides. They've asked for references. Yeah, now the thank yous are streaming in. Somebody asked for a specific example of an ethic that you think has changed in, say, the last 6 months, year.
Let me zoom back even further.
Yeah, good.
We have just as a small difference. We have research has shown that people are becoming more comfortable. You know, people engage in more aggressive tactics. Let's say over email and even over video, perhaps, but primarily towards people at a distance. Okay, people are more able to be unethical. They're able to lie. They're able to be crueler. Okay, so we know all those things. I can't imagine, and this is just, again, in the realm of my imagination, I can't imagine that over time, if we get used to being cruel, demeaning, racist, aggressive towards people just because they are not in front of us, I don't believe that over time that doesn't filter into how we act with people in the room. Okay, that's just an example. There are all sorts of differences. There is research going on about how people lie via different media. Again, that's in the via kind of, and they're showing that people lie most. Well, it's hard to know what the most up-to-date research is on this because it changes all the time. People used to lie most via text, but also, interestingly enough, people were most offended when other people lied to them via text. So I think both parts of this are interesting. That a media should affect how we, not just how we frame our discussions, but it affects what the borders of our behavior are. I find that fascinating. I also find it fascinating that our response to ethical infringements is media dependent. And I just can't imagine that that doesn't, over time, trickle in and affect how we are in a room. That's just an example. I know it's kind of a sidestep and that's what comes to mind, but I think that that's real.
There's another one that says, I'm not sure our baseline humanness will change, only how we access and utilize it. Any comments?
That is a great, only to say that is a great comment, and I wonder. I don't know quite what humanness is as opposed to exactly, our manifestations of humanness. I don't know exactly which is imprinted at what level. And that might lead a little deeper into the philosophical realm that I'm underqualified to comment on. I will say, though, that much as I ponder that question often, and since I'm not qualified to go too deeply, I don't know the answer, I'm going to suggest this goes deeper than we think. I'll leave it at that. That's where I come off on it every time.
Nikki, I'm not able to scroll up on the comments. Can you do that?
Yes, I can, and actually, I can also share a screen of the comments that I have been collecting. If that's okay, right. And we can kind of scroll through those in turn a little bit. So this is kind of chronological order, and the first one, I don't know if everybody can see
the
this.
union one was the first, yeah.
Yeah.
if a union declines teleconferencing to mediate an employee grievance until after the pandemic, and such a potentially long indeterminate delay would prejudice one of the parties, what do you suggest to be able to move forward via teleconferencing? It's a tough one.
You know, to the extent that I was asked, I can say I don't know. I don't know, and so I don't know if it's tougher than anything else. You know, in the sense that in the early days of online mediation, and I'm talking 2 decades back, there were all sorts of assumptions about what would work via video conferencing and what wouldn't. And the assumptions back then were largely that, yeah, you can have kind of low value economic discussions via this, but anything that requires real feelings, you're not going to want to do that online. But the phones
Wow. That's
that
quite a
rang in
statement.
the office of online mediators were people who had workplace issues and divorce issues. And they were the first voluntary consumers of online mediation.
Right.
Actually were surprisingly those. So that's just my way of not directly answering, but saying, I don't make an assumption that anything is out of reach necessarily. I think it's more a question of picking the question apart and wondering, what are your assumptions about why that would not be advisable or would be advisable? And what is the essence of the process? And is there anything in the media that is constrained or just denied because of the media? And I think we'll all discover that we can do more than we think we can.
Mm-hmm. Someone else wants to know if there are any studies on reading emotions from a headshot on a computer screen, facial display of feelings.
I know there's a lot of work in practice. I need to think. Feel free to write me, and I'll see if I have material on that. There's a lot of work in practice. What they're trying to do. The answer is yes. I can't spout it offhand. Now I'm remembering.
Okay. Okay.
There's a lot of work in practice, and this is really important because perhaps you could get involved in this. I know I've been asked about it by industry folks who are trying to develop facial expression readers. I mean, imagine if during this Zoom call, not only can you see my facial expressions, and so we, you know, a big step over email, we put facial cues back into it, and some degree of body language. But imagine if a screen or like a caption would now pop up on your side of the screen saying your counterpart is really excited now, or he's suspicious now, or he's angry now, based on real scientific analysis of my facial. I think that would be something that's both on one hand creepy, but it's also really, really valuable. And that work is in development. There are different companies working on that just now. There are even working products. So you can look into that.
Another question that came up several times in a discussion was about Zoom exhaustion. Someone said in a face-to-face mediation, it may go on for 8 or 10 hours, a whole day. But how do you feel about, or what have you observed about that sort of online exhaustion where I just can't take sitting in front of this screen another minute?
A great, acute, and painful question, which I would suggest to use as an example of me saying, most questions that I get asked about online processes essentially is not a technological question. It's a mediation question. It's a process question. You would deal with the same question in a room to some extent. You would deal with that problem in a room to a different extent if the room had slightly harder chairs, or slightly less light, or the air conditioning wasn't working just as well, and you would either make physical adaptations,
Right.
or you would make process adaptations in order to accommodate that and to work around it. And my suggestion is make process accommodations for that, to stir something into the mix. This notion that mediations are whole day ventures is a, I won't say uniquely, but it's a predominantly United States notion. In other places around the world, mediation sessions are often broken down into 2-3 hour sessions.
Segments.
And this whole day, which serves several purposes, some of them better than others. I mean, it saves money on convening and convenience on convening. And some would say, well, exhausting parties is a positive attribute or, a side benefit of that. And other peoples would say, actually, I find that problematic. I'm not putting my judgment over anyone, but that's not my preferred mode of mediating. But so maybe 2 or 3 hours at a time is beneficial if you can set the exhaustion towards settlement. Set that aside, think about it. One of the reasons that people got together for 8-hour sessions is because of travel or convening costs, or, it's me and you and your lawyer, and everybody needs to come together. While we're online, the price of that can disappear. The impossibility of bringing everybody together 3 times disappears. So you might want to reconsider your process. If our processes are set in stone,
Great.
you're in trouble. This is a great time to rethink your processes. And I'll also add a side benefit. When you come back, since you will now be rethinking what parts of this are actually process essential, process positive, process supportive, you'll be rethinking all of your assumptions about process. And when you come back to the room, you will have new thoughts about your in-room process. And you will improve. You'll be a better in-room mediator because of the thinking you did as a online mediator. You can take that to the bank.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right about that. Someone else says, have you found any way of measuring the social impact of the percentage of mediators, lawyers on the social commons? Are we having an impact? Are people learning better ways of managing their conflicts because we keep teaching and mediating? Are those skills we are teaching moving online too? Well, we know the answer to that one, but changes you've observed.
I'm wondering, I'm trying to make sure I answer or relate to the right question. Is your sense that the question is, all in all, whether online or offline, are we moving the social needle? Are in the end, is all our work combined, are we changing the way individuals and society as a whole manages conflict? Is that your sense of the question?
Well, I also think it has to do with the social impact of the number of mediators and lawyers who are now online. Is that opening, is that opening the field more?
Oh, that I can certainly say. Look, online, it both splashes, advertisement and awareness. And my answer would be certainly, without conducting, market polls. I don't need to, and I think that this has been my impression. I run into mediation advertisements, explanations by mistake, by which I mean even when I'm on other people's computers, not necessarily that Facebook or Google is shoving it at me. So I think in terms of that very basic awareness, my guess would be yes. A guess, but or sense, my guess would be yes. Is that moving the social needle? In other words, in what we've been speaking about for decades, if only everybody knew about what we have to offer, this is what I call the Super Bowl theory, Super Bowl ad theory of conflict resolution. If only we had a 30-second ad during the Super Bowl, just to tell people what mediation is. They'd all be on their phone, they'd drop their nachos and guacamole and rush to the phone and call their lawyers and say, what's going on? How come you haven't told me about this? I don't know if A, whether we've achieved that, or B, whether that's effective, or whether that's the right way to really move the needle that we're looking to move. But I would say that there certainly are some people who in a targeted manner are really looking to spread the word through different online ways. They're doing quite a wonderful job. So we have both the mass of people going online, and then we have a certain number or a certain percentage of really media savvy or media active folks who are kind of pushing the borders of how far we can spread this. I think we're in a different place than we were 10 years ago. Yep.
Yeah, it's true. My observation of you and your level of comfort with this is, and it's a great role model. You are a great role model. You know, get out of the cockpit. I love it. Get your head out of the cockpit and
No,
just.
let me back away from that phrase. Although
No, I love
trying
it.
to work on letting people say something nice and not like correcting them. Let me say, even the fact that you know of some
It
of my work.
spoke to me loud and clear. Here's another one. This is a social question, you know, what about access to technology? This is a privilege. How does conflict theory and practice address inequity virtually? That's a tough one.
It's a tough one. The answer is, to some extent, it doesn't, beyond mentioning the digital divide. The digital divide is changing. I think that the digital divide is not necessarily what everybody has in mind of, oh, here we have technology, there they don't. It's a more nuanced divide now. I mean, there are smartphones in the least developed places in the world. There are many people with smartphones. On the other hand, right here in the US, you know, where we say, well, most people have smartphones or most people have access, there's an economic difference that says that, you know, I can pay for broadband internet, unlimited broadband internet, and other people can't. And that there's a privilege issue there, and it's an inequity. And it's not, it is discussed, it's not discussed enough. It's coming to the forefront now in different conversations. I've heard this with court administrators and mediators over the past few days, who've said, look, but this whole thing, like, let's just take it online, do this all by video conference. Some people pay for their data by the minute. But you're going to schedule a 3-hour mediation, you know, or whatever it is, or a 3-hour court hearing for about child custody in a contested situation for someone who has a data plan of, you know, 1 gigabyte a month. Like, think about that. And you know, and more privileged people are kind of going like, oh, like, I didn't even know, is that still an issue? And sure it is. So I think that as mediators, we definitely need to think about that. Sure, our corporate clients and lawyers, and you know, they likely have all of these, you know, large packages that they don't, data packages they don't have to worry about. But if we're doing work with, you know, anybody in the middle class, people need to think about that. And there are other options. There is mediation via text, and there's mediation via email, there's mediation. There are platforms that are dedicated to that. And there are other ways. The jump to Zoom was very quick.
Right.
But that creates inequity. And we're gonna hear more about that, by the way, when we read about universities. Because in universities, when universities jumped online, and most of them jumped online to synchronous video, just like mediation did, there were a lot of voices shouting out, but that is not fair. Campus flattens some of the inequities, because at least on campus I have unlimited internet, or I have, you know, a library with devices that I can use. When I go back home, I'm on a data package this side, and I need it for emergencies. So if we can listen to that discussion and realize that it has to do with mediation and everything we do nowadays online, that would be the right way to go. Thanks for asking.
I have an illustration of that. I'm on the board of a small choral group in Trenton, New Jersey. So largely African American, largely poor, disadvantaged kids. And we were able to raise enough money to make laptops available to them. And 60% of them were never picked up. Because it's just not part of their language. They don't get it. All right, we could go on for hours. Nikki has taken the questions off my screen. Maybe she has some more she wants to pose. I don't know.
No, I just thought,
if there isn't a live question, someone can raise their hand, because I'm sure there's still a few, and then we'll wrap up.
There are dozens. but there are also lots of thanks.
Well,
And everybody, I apologize for comments or questions that I'm not responding to. If anybody wants to take this further, I'm easily findable. Just write me an email.
Listen, thank you a ton for this presentation. We are going to publish the questions also,
Oh, good.
so you'll get to see them. Nikki's in the background there doing all kinds of technical things. People wanted the questions and the comments. There were lots of comments. This was a fabulous presentation, Noam. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Noam. This was great.
Add anything?
My great pleasure. And I didn't mean to say that in order to wrap this up. If you would
No.
like to go on, or people would, I'm
I
still
don't know.
standing.
Yeah, you're still standing.
we always end at 10, and so
Okay.
some individuals left at 10 just because that's the expectation. We can leave this open, and if anyone wants to chat or speak, feel free to stay on. Perhaps raise your hand and we'll recognize you. That way we don't have cross-talking. I don't see any.
I'm going to have to ring off, but thanks so much for this, Noam. This was wonderful. That was Chuck.
Thank you, everybody. And just to answer generally what I'm trying to be answering in the chat, we will be sending a follow-up email with links to the video, the chat, the PowerPoint presentation. I just posted Noam's email in the chat. It's also on the PowerPoint, so there'll be plenty of information and fodder for follow-up. And thank you all for your participation.
Right, and Noam, if you're having a bad day, you'll love the chat. There's so many compliments and so many thank yous and so many, wow, you really sent me home thinking, oh, wait, I'm already home. But anyway, thanks a ton.
We have a question from Richard Anthony. Richard?
Hello.
All right, thank you. I guess I think here in Nigeria, the mediation projects need to develop more, particularly from the court-attached mediation centers. Most of the mediators don't really have the requisite expertise to handle mediations with the courts. And I think recently, because I am CUNY accredited mediator, recently I find myself mediating in some high court cases referred to mediation centers in the high court. From analysis, we found out that most of the court-attached mediators don't have the requisite qualifications. And I think that is something that we need to partner with the judicial system in Nigeria to see that those asked to mediate, appointed to mediate in the centers, have the requisite qualifications. You know, aside from that, we also have what is called the Court of Appeal in Nigeria, the Court of Appeal mediation centers that was recently developed, but up to now, it has not taken off. But we kind of experience legal practitioners' apathy to mediation centers because some of them largely feel it's not our thing yet. But I think in a contrast, it's actually our thing because with the global dynamics, mediation, we can't do without mediation.
Richard, do you have a question?
My question, probably, not question per se, probably remarks. Probably remarks on how we can help develop mediation in other areas in Africa. Probably that is something I need to hard to read.
Any other questions?
If I would jump on just to respond to that, to bring it into the context of what we spoke about, I think that any opportunity that we have, whether in Nigeria or in New York City, to set up a new system of mediation, which might include a new system of mediation qualification, would really do well to rethink everything we think we know about mediation. There, I'm just putting that out as like a tiny, oh, here's something you can do in your spare time. But in other words, every time you implement, you can either do more of the same, or you can use it as an opportunity to put some of these what has changed thoughts into practice. So I would say jump on those as an opportunity to think about this.
Other questions?
I have a question that I posted on the chat, Julia from New Jersey, and I'm interested in getting into mediation with school and special services. There seems to be a big gap and a big disparity in how services are delivered. And, you know, I echo what Julia was saying about getting some support and services to some communities in Trenton. It's challenging. I just needed to say I worked at a district that it's you know, totally upside down. My question to Noam is how do you actually engage in mediation online, thinking about privacy, and what does that look like? I noticed that when you know, there's lots of different issues, but you know, I stay with the privacy issues when you discuss mediation and services for kids, especially with special needs. How does that look like when you do mediation online, and where does who gets their hands on that mediation clip?
I'm gonna give you a very partial answer.
Okay.
And then relate another bit of that to the larger theme of today.
Yes.
And then send you off to do some thinking for yourself.
Yes.
The direct but short answer is there really is no way to ensure completely that what is said in the room stays in the room. I'll go further and say that there's really no way to ensure that in a face-to-face process either.
I know.
Okay?
I know.
So
yes.
Unless you manage to somehow implant a chip into people's brains that will explode if they say, "But the mediator told me."
Yes.
Or unless you take people's cell phones away from them.
Absolutely.
So they're not recorded. So the fact that exists, let's say on Zoom, on Zoom, you know if I'm recording, right? You see on the upper left, you'll see that it says recording. But you don't know if I'm recording this session either by having a cell phone aimed at it from a corner that you don't see, or by having some screen capture program running in the background. So the answer is, there really is no way. And that's a problem. In fact, you don't know. I might have someone else here in the room with me taking notes, writing things down, and you just don't know about it.
Yes.
So one of my answers about, but how do we do that through technology is, look, the gold standard, assuming that, well, in the room that all works, that's all fine. So it's hard to work with technology. We have this fallacy about the gold standard all over negotiation and mediation. Okay? That's one part of an answer. And so the second part is, you know, some platforms are better than others. Some have internal recordings, and some tell you when it's being internally recorded, and some don't. But essentially, there's no way to prevent it. So again, it returns it to being a process issue. Just like in the room, you'd really want to say, they can go and talk about it if they want to, and they will. Is there any way that I can incentivize them not to do that? Through process, to make them appreciate the value.
Yes.
And it returns to that question. And the final thing that I'll say, commenting, bringing it back to the larger topic, is we have these assumptions about privacy.
Yes.
People's desire for privacy, people's need for privacy, what people are willing to share and what they aren't. It has been codified to some extent, so we have rules, right? But I think we all know that people's attitudes towards privacy have been changing over the past generation. And here's another example of a negotiation, mediation, and conflict issue in which people have changed, but our thinking about it, our actions have not. And I'll just leave that as food for thought.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much. It's sort of like the way you frame it and how you come together. I mean, even in actual live meetings, things do get out of hand, and it's not ensured the privacy really stays in the room, you know. Yeah.
Okay, Patricia McGuire is raising her hand. Patricia? Oh, Patricia, you're muted. There you go.
Am I unmuted now?
You're
Okay.
okay.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. Noam, I sent you a couple of messages, and it's basically to shore up what you were saying. One of the questions that were raised, and I find it so important, is how, as mediators, can we spread the word to push the envelope to get people to buy into mediation more? And I think this is so timely because now I also am a judge in Canada. And what I find that was so inefficient, and I might have colleagues on the line who might criticize me, is how the justice system has failed the people as a third arm of government in that it just shut down completely. And you get these notices. So now people are depending on the courts to resolve their problems, but they just find out that I can't go to court because the court is shut down indefinitely. Yet I'm an arbitrator as well, and I'm able to conduct an arbitration for a whole day and be able to give a bench decision while the court is not functioning. And that is the government that is given to the people to resolve. So when people are hearing that mediators are solving my problems and much more, I'm able to contribute towards the solution of my problem. They would be, and it is cheaper, and they don't have to wait 2 years on a docket. I think that would motivate people to become more involved. And I think this is a great, to me, I see these are one of the positives of SARS-CoV-19. And we should see these opportunities instead of hemming and hawing about the danger of SARS. And to go back to my colleague's question about privacy, I've had that experience in private mediations, in person, where people are texting away what's going on, even though you're telling them that they're confidential experiences. So there is no limit on privacy as long as human beings are involved. There's only so much control we have. And unless you can control the total person, your control of privacy and whether it stays within the realm in which it is said, it's very limited. Whether you're online, in fact, I'd hasten to add that we might be safer online than we are in person. So I just wanted to add that. And I really think as people in ADR, we need to talk to our courts and make them more friendly to who we are and let them see that we are problem solvers and not their competitors, because we're here to serve the public. It's not about us. We've got to become more client focused, and the people are the clients of the court, not the judge or the clients of the people. And we need to be more focused in that way. Thanks.
I don't think anybody on this line is going to argue with you on anything you said. So I'm just going to let those stand. Absolutely. Julie, did you want to comment on that?
No, I'm just noticing that people are dropping off pretty steadily, and we're about to lose another facilitator here. My sense is that mostly what we have left here are people making comments rather than asking questions. Are there any other critical questions? And if so, Tom Rothschild, dear friend Tom, up in there. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you, Julie. So my question relates to something that you said before about there being new technology that can read facial expressions possibly and then post something about them. And your earlier comment that people are lying more on online settings, and they will undoubtedly learn how to game the system on getting the technology to report a false emotion. And so one of the questions, and for me, I'm facing this right now, is how do we build trust in the online setting? How do we get people to start to trust one another? Not maybe easier to trust the mediator. Hopefully they presume the mediator is trustworthy or they wouldn't be there, but particularly if it's voluntary. but how do we build trust among people in an online world?
And I look forward to the future teaching us the answer to that all-important question. Let me kind of put some ideas out there. There is a very large literature on trust and trust building. There's a lot of research that has been done, and a lot of both conceptual, theoretical, and practical research. We know relatively a lot about trust. We also know quite a bit about the effects of online media on trust. Okay, so if you want kind of an introduction to some of that, you can again Google Noam Ebner SSRN and pick an article. Some of them have trust in the title, and it's just as an entry point in the bibliography. We'll send you on to other places. Of course, as technology develops, untrustworthy behavior will follow, or by the way, vice versa. There will be this same technology for facial recognition that we say is used to gauge emotions, let's say. It's also just a different product can be developed to identify negative emotions or sinister behavior. Just to give it as an example, I won't give the specific example, but someone who is developing a product like this consulted with me on it and was considering which way to go with this, because their same product, they said, we could either develop its uses for online negotiation, or we could develop its use, and for business, or we could develop its uses for what's called homeland security, okay? Because imagine yourself in an airport and you have an interview being conducted, and you know, the software could identify nervousness, could identify lying, could identify malintent, right? So that's actually used to stop the bad folks from bad activity. So part of the solution is technology, which goes both ways.
Or thinks it can identify.
My name is Danny Evie.
Absolutely.
CEO of Business Agent.
Whoever's talking, we're having trouble hearing you.
If someone's watching a clip.
Okay, go back to Noam.
It can go back both ways. Look, in the end, it boils down to trust. It's going to boil down to trust. The question of whether we use this software or not, the question whether we pre-agree to use the software or not, is something that's going to be, going to be decided. There will be perhaps a whole new checklist of things that we discuss before we begin a negotiation or mediation. It might be that the mediator's introduction will be completely different in a generation. Part of that will be because of technology. Other parts of it will be because of technology's deeper effects on people. Okay, so there are the direct and indirect. And I think trust is a great place to start looking for where can these changes be. And that's why in this article, Negotiation is Changing, I did dedicate a section to how trust is changing. But there's also that other whole literature on trust building and trust gaining, negotiation, mediation.
Noam, I trust that this has been a fabulous presentation. I'm going to arbitrarily end it now. Thank you so much. Here's to the future of online mediation, arbitration, whatever. Thanks a ton.
And I thank you all. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, everybody. I hope to meet you at some point.
Right.
With a
Get
bagel,
to New York
with a bagel
and
between us.
And come to the Roundtable.
Thank you so much, Noam.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Stay
Thank you, everybody.
Be safe.
Bye-bye.
Stay safe, folks.
Yep, thank you.
So how do we end this?
Oh, hold it. Before we do that, I want to save the chat.
Right.
Alex.
Yes,
Did you set that for us to save the chat?
I believe it'll automatically.
I think Nikki did that. Yeah.
I think we all thought it was part of the.
I think it'll be in Maria. It will be in probably your
Email.
yeah. By the way, are we stopping recording? Can we stop
We-
this?